I took the job because I needed the money, and at the time, moving from place to place felt easier than standing still long enough to realize how lonely my life had become. Back then, I worked seasonal jobs. Forestry, maintenance, trail clearing, anything outdoors that paid enough to keep me going. One summer, that work brought me deep into northern Maine, near the edge of the North Maine woods. If you've never been there, it's difficult to explain the kind of isolation those places hold. The roads stretch endlessly through forests that seem untouched for decades. Sometimes you can drive for an hour without seeing another person. At night, it feels less like the world is sleeping, and more like the world forgot you existed. The company gave me a small cabin near one of the logging roads. It wasn't much, just an old wooden structure with weak locks, thin walls, and a porch that creaked every time the wind touched it. During the day, trucks passed often enough that it felt connected to civilization. But at night, once the engines disappeared into the distance, the silence became something heavier, almost alive. There were other workers nearby, scattered across different cabins, but not close enough to casually visit. Out there, everyone respected space. People trusted each other too. That's how those communities worked. Cars stayed unlocked. Doors stayed open. Nobody expected trouble because nobody believed anyone would travel that far into the wilderness just to hurt somebody. And eventually, I stopped expecting danger too. At first, everything felt normal. Long, exhausting days. Quiet evenings alone. The kind of routine that slowly numbs your thoughts. Honestly, part of me liked it. I've never been very social. Silence has always felt more comforting to me than crowds ever did. Then small things started happening. One afternoon, I came back from work and noticed the cabin door wasn't fully shut, just slightly open, barely enough to notice. I remember staring at it for a second before convincing myself I had probably left in a hurry that morning and failed to latch it properly. Nothing inside looked wrong, so I ignored it. A few days later, I found one of the windows cracked open. Again, not enough to immediately alarm me, just enough to make me pause. I told myself I probably opened it earlier for fresh air and forgot. When you spend enough time alone, your memory becomes unreliable. Days blur together. Small details disappear. But then the food started disappearing. At first, it was tiny things. Bread running out too quickly. Missing cans. Open packages I didn't remember touching. I spent days convincing myself I was simply exhausted and forgetting what I ate. Until one night, I realized a sealed package had clearly been opened while I was gone. I sat there staring at it, and for the first time, something cold settled into my chest. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Like my mind already knew the truth before I was willing to admit it. That same night, while trying to distract myself, I ended up watching a random video online about someone secretly living inside another person's home. And the deeper I got into the video, the worse my stomach felt. Every detail sounded familiar. The missing food, the strange movements, the feeling that something was wrong without knowing why. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak in the cabin sounded deliberate. Every shift of the wind made my pulse jump. I kept staring at the darkness, wondering if someone was already inside with me. The next day, I bought cameras. 3 of them. I placed them around the cabin while pretending to myself that this was all paranoia, that I'd watch the footage later and feel stupid for overreacting. I was wrong. The recordings changed something inside me permanently. There were 2 men. Not 1. 2. And they had been entering my cabin for days. Sometimes during the afternoon while I was at work. Sometimes at night while I slept only a few feet away. What terrified me most wasn't that they entered. It was how comfortable they were doing it. They walked through the cabin like they belonged there. One of them would casually go into the kitchen, eat my food, sit on my couch, turn on the television, use the bathroom, like he was spending time in his own home. But the other man still haunts me. Whenever I wasn't home, He would spend most of his time inside my bedroom. I never placed cameras there, so I still don't know exactly what he did. But when I was asleep inside the cabin, his behavior became deeply disturbing. He would go through my dirty laundry. Slowly, carefully. He picked up my work clothes and smelled them. My shirts, my socks, even my underwear. Then he started putting them on. Watching that footage felt unreal. Like watching something your brain refuses to process correctly because no normal explanation exists for it. Then he would lie on the floor wrapped in my clothes like they meant something to him. And after that, he walked into my bedroom while I was asleep. He stayed there for almost 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Even now, years later, I still replay that number in my head sometimes. 20 minutes standing inside my room while I slept completely unaware. I don't know what he did. I don't know if he touched anything. I don't know if he stood over me. And honestly, I think not knowing is worse. I remember sitting alone in that cabin replaying the footage over and over until the sun came up. Every time I watched it, I noticed something new. Something worse. It felt like the safety of my entire life had shattered in a single night. Because after seeing that, sleep no longer feels safe. Being alone no longer feels peaceful. Your own home stops feeling like yours. I called the police immediately and handed over everything. The company moved me to another location that same day and warned the other workers nearby. To their credit, they took it seriously. Security was increased. Officers searched the area for days. But they never found those men. No names. No arrests. Nothing. And the worst part is knowing they were probably watching me for a long time before I ever noticed them. Even now, I can't sleep in a room without cameras. Every apartment I've lived in since then has security systems, motion alerts, reinforced locks. Friends joke about how paranoid I've become. But paranoia feels different when you've watched strangers stand over you while you slept. And sometimes, late at night, I still think about that cabin. About those recordings. About the 20 minutes inside my bedroom. And about how close a person can stand to you in the dark without you ever waking up. By the time I moved in with Mark, my life hadn't dramatically collapsed. It had simply worn down slowly in ways that were harder to explain. I was 35 years old, recently out of a relationship that ended with the kind of emotional exhaustion that drains your finances along with your dignity. Rent prices kept rising. My savings kept shrinking. And eventually, after weeks of pretending everything was manageable, I reached the humiliating conclusion that I either needed a roommate or I needed to move back in with family. And at 35, that felt like failure. The apartment itself seemed perfect. Cheap rent, quiet neighborhood, close to work. The kind of deal that feels like luck when you're desperate enough to stop asking questions. Mark was older than me, worked remotely, rarely left the apartment, and appeared incredibly organized. At first, he honestly seemed ideal. Quiet, clean, responsible. The kind of roommate you hope for after years of bad experiences. And for the first couple weeks, everything felt fine. Then the small things started happening. One evening, I brought groceries home after work. I carried half upstairs, then went back down for the rest. When I returned a few minutes later, the groceries were already unpacked. Not casually, carefully, perfectly organized. Vegetables cleaned, containers sorted by size, pantry items aligned with almost obsessive precision. When I asked Mark about it, he simply looked at me and said, "You look tired today." That was it. No apology. No acknowledgement that touching someone else's belongings might be strange. At first, I convinced myself he was just socially awkward. Then it kept happening. Laundry I left in the dryer appeared folded neatly on my bed. Bathroom items were reorganized without permission. Chargers untangled. Drawers cleaned. Receipts thrown away. And eventually, I realized he had been entering my bedroom while I was gone. That was the moment something shifted emotionally. Because there's a difference between somebody being helpful and somebody quietly inserting themselves into your personal life without invitation. I confronted him politely that night. I told him I appreciated the intention, but I needed him to stop entering my room and touching my belongings. He stared at me for several seconds with this strange expression. Not guilt, confusion, like he genuinely couldn't understand why I would object. Finally, he nodded and quietly said he understood. But after that, everything changed. He became colder. Not openly hostile, just unsettling. If I left dishes in the sink, they would later appear outside my bedroom door. If I ordered takeout, he made passive comments about irresponsible spending. If I came home late, he somehow always noticed. One night, after drinks with coworkers, I returned around 1 a.m. and found him sitting silently in the living room with the television muted, waiting. When I walked in, he looked at the microwave clock before calmly saying, "You said you'd probably be home earlier." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten immediately, not because the words themselves were threatening, but because they sounded possessive, like my schedule belonged to him. I laughed awkwardly and told him plans changed, but he responded by saying, "Routine is important." The tone felt less like conversation and more like correction. After that, the text started. Questions about where I was, when I'd be home, who I was with, whether I had work in the morning. At first, I ignored them. Then one night, after not responding for several hours, he texted, "You're becoming impulsive again." Again. That word bothered me deeply, because it implied history. It implied observation. It implied he had been mentally tracking my behavior long enough to believe he understood patterns about my personality better than I did. That's when fear really started setting in. Not fear of violence. Fear of being psychologically consumed by someone who no longer viewed me as an equal adult, but as a project, a responsibility, something to manage. The breaking point came on a day he finally left the apartment for several hours. I don't know what pushed me to do it, but the second he left, I entered his room. Even now, I know it sounds hypocritical after confronting him for invading my privacy, but by then, instinct was screaming at me that something was deeply wrong. His room was spotless, unnaturally spotless, like nobody truly lived there. In the bottom drawer of his desk, underneath several folders, I found a black notebook, and the moment I opened it, I felt physically sick. The notebook was entirely about me. Pages and pages documenting my life in disturbing detail. Wake-up times, meals, mood changes, alcohol consumption, financial habits, phone calls, social patterns, entire sections labeled corrective measures. Underneath were lists describing methods to improve my behavior, ways to limit distractions, ways to increase discipline, ways to reduce impulsive habits. And then it got worse, far worse. I found pages discussing non-compliance, regression, environmental instability. Under those headings were ideas like hide access to convenience items, restrict internet availability, interfere with transportation, limit financial flexibility. The wording was calm, clinical, like he genuinely believed he was helping me become a better version of myself. I remember feeling this overwhelming horror because I realized I had accidentally moved in with someone who had quietly built an entire fantasy around controlling another human being. And while I was reading, I heard the front door unlock. The sound instantly froze my blood. I walked into the hallway still holding the notebook, and the second Mark saw it, his face changed completely. Not rage, exposure, like I had uncovered something sacred. I told him to stay away from me while calling the police. That's when he lunged for the notebook. We struggled briefly before I dropped it, and instead of panicking, he calmly picked it up, walked to the stove, turned on the burner, and started feeding pages into the flame one by one. The calmness terrified me more than screaming would have. He wasn't emotional. He was solving a problem. By the time police arrived, most of the evidence had turned to ash. I moved out that same day. I terminated the lease immediately and filed for a restraining order, though there wasn't enough evidence for much legal action. As far as I know, Mark is still out there, still advertising rooms online, still presenting himself as a quiet, responsible roommate. And somewhere, eventually, another desperate person is probably going to mistake his obsession for kindness, the same way I did. Some people are dangerous in obvious ways. They explode. They threaten. They leave destruction behind them so clearly that everyone sees it. But the most terrifying people are the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who spend years learning exactly how far they can push before anyone notices. I met him when we were children. I grew up in a rural part of Tennessee where houses sat far apart and most of life happened outdoors. Kids wandered between properties. Everyone knew each other. It felt safe in the way small communities often do, at least on the surface. I was around 9 years old when I first noticed him. He was older than most of us by a few years. Not physically intimidating, not aggressive in obvious ways, but there was something deeply wrong in how he interacted with people. He loved conflict, not participating in it, creating it. He would whisper things to one person, then say something different to another, carefully planting tension until arguments exploded around him. And every time it happened, he watched with this strange satisfaction that didn't match the situation. At first, everyone dismissed it as childish behavior, but I noticed patterns. Because I was quiet, I spent more time observing people than talking. And eventually, he noticed me noticing him. I still remember the exact feeling of that moment. He was standing between two boys he had manipulated into arguing when he suddenly looked directly at me. Not casually, not accidentally, directly. And something in his expression changed, like he realized I understood what he was doing. After that, I became part of the game too. Rumors started circulating about me. Small lies. Tiny manipulations designed to isolate me socially without ever being obvious enough to confront directly. And over time, people slowly started believing parts of it. Years passed. Then when we were around 16, one of the boys from his friend group died during a camping trip. Officially, it was ruled an accident. He fell into a ravine during the daytime. But things about the story never felt right. The boy who died was experienced outdoors, careful, familiar with the terrain, and more importantly, there had been growing tension between him and the other boy for months beforehand, because he had started noticing the manipulation too. A few years later, another member of the group admitted they had lied about what happened that day. He confessed that the group had not been spread out like they originally claimed. At one point, only 2 boys were missing. The dead boy, and him. Even after hearing that, nothing happened legally. No investigation reopened. No charges. Just rumors spreading quietly through the community while people convinced themselves it was easier not to know the truth. But over time, he became worse. Colder. More confident. Like someone who realized suspicion means nothing if nobody can prove anything. Eventually, adulthood separated us. Different lives. Different routines. For years, I barely saw him. Then 3 years ago, I bought a house and started a family. And only after moving in did I discover the house next door belonged to his great-grandparents. A year later, he moved in. At first, he acted strangely friendly toward me. Too friendly. The kind of friendliness that feels rehearsed rather than genuine. I caught him talking to my wife several times when I wasn't around. Nothing openly inappropriate, but always slightly invasive. Like he enjoyed testing boundaries without crossing them far enough to be confronted. Then about a week and a half ago, my son told us something that made my blood run cold. He had been secretly talking to him. Not casually, repeatedly, and worse, they had discussed meeting near the exact same ravine where that boy died years earlier. The moment my son said it, I felt this overwhelming wave of fear unlike anything I've experienced before. Not panic, not anger, recognition, because suddenly every uncomfortable feeling I had buried for years connected together all at once. I realized he had started working on my son the same way he used to work on us when we were children. Slowly, patiently, quietly building trust. I went to the police immediately and told them everything. The history, the manipulation, the old death, the conversations with my son. But without evidence, there was little they could do. So now I lived beside him, every single day. I installed cameras around the house. I warned my son never to speak to him again under any circumstances. My wife double-checks locks every night before bed. And still, it never fully feels safe. Because people imagine danger as something loud. But real danger often looks ordinary. It smiles politely, waves from across the yard, asks how your family is doing, and waits patiently for the exact moment your guard slips. At this point, I'm seriously considering moving away completely. Not because I want to run, but because deep down, I no longer believe distance matters to people like him. And sometimes late at night, when I see his porch light turn on across the property line, I still think about that boy who died in the ravine all those years ago. And I wonder how many people noticed the truth, but chose silence because proving evil is much harder than surviving it.